Hello and welcome to another Design Clips here at W+9. This is Dawn, and in today's video we are going to be doing a little bit of pattern stamping. Okay, a lot bit of pattern stamping. It's one of my favorite techniques, so I thought I would share with you guys some of the tips and tricks that I use when I'm stamping out my own patterns. We're going to be using the No One Else stamp set. This is one of our new sets and I love it. It's perfect for this technique. The large, bold sentiments in this set stand out really well against a busier background. And then you have several different sizes of leaves and flowers included in the set so that you can really build out some robust patterns. Now, this is how I store mine. I go ahead and print it out and then I put it into my sheet. But here you can see that this set does have matching dies. Everywhere that's indicated in red is a matching die. Now, the great thing about the sentiments are the big, bold thank you and kindness. They're actually all contained on one die, so you can do some negative die cutting. You can use the die cuts and the sentiments together, or you could use the resulting die cut letters. It's really up to you. There's a lot of different options. And of course, there is a die for each of the floral elements as well, but we're not going to be using any of those dies today. We will be using the sentiment die. So when I'm creating an all-over pattern, the first two things I do are decide on my color palette and my grouping of elements that will make up my all-over pattern. And to do that, I'll stamp out a bunch of different combinations on scratch piece of paper. Here I'm just exploring my options as far as color and arrangement go. Then I'm going to decide which ones I want to use in my final pattern. I'm looking for a large cluster or grouping, which is often referred to as the hero. So I'm going to go ahead and isolate those so I know that's going to be my largest pattern or grouping within my pattern. Then I want to pick out at least two more. I'll want a large, a medium, and a small. And looking at this grouping here, I actually have two good options for my medium. I could either do the one that I've circled here on the left or the right, just depending on how much space I have once I stamp that hero graphic across the background. And then I'm going to pick out my smallest pattern, which is this one here. Now that leaves me with some other little elements stamped out there that could be used as fillers in areas where I have too much of a gap. So you could stamp repeats of either of the flowers that you've stamped, you could do more of the leaves, or you could use the tiniest little stamps and stamp them repeatedly to fill in any gaps. Sometimes you don't have enough room for another floral cluster, but the spaces are just too big to leave blank, so that's where the fillers come in handy. Now we're going to start stamping out our pattern, and we're going to start with our hero graphic. I usually like to start either in the upper left or the lower right. I don't like to start my pattern right dead in the center. Sometimes that just doesn't look quite right. So I like to offset mine, either start with my hero graphic in the upper left or the lower right, but it's really up to you. So I'm going to start stamping out each of my clusters. I've chosen for my color palette our Warm Wool, Sweet Nectar, Wild Mango, Ocean Drive, and Falling Star. I'm working on our Oatmeal cardstock, which is an off-white color. So the colors are going to be a bit more muted than they looked when I was stamping them on white. And in hindsight, I think I do like them better stamped on the white. And if I were to do this card again, I would definitely do it on white. But since I paired it with craft in the end, I do like the way it turned out. So I'm just going to start building, like I said, that first hero cluster. And I've got my guide off to the side and I'm referencing it, but I'm not staying super strict to it. If I need to move something around a little bit here and there, I'm going to do that. This is my pattern. Nobody's going to be judging it, hopefully. It doesn't have to be perfect. Basically, I'm using that as a guide. I'm going to continue stamping out this largest cluster and cover the background. I'm going to stagger it each time, so you'll notice that I'm going up and to the left a little bit. And I'm also stamping out the entire largest cluster before moving on to the next one. That's so that I can make sure that I'm leaving enough space in between these larger clusters to fit in the other patterns or the other little clusters that I've created. That's just what works for me. I've tried this several times and inevitably I will stamp them too close together and I won't be able to fit in all of the elements. But it's not a showstopper because once I've got the whole background covered with that hero graphic, it really is kind of the star of the show. And the rest of those little clusters are just going to support that one. So if you put some of them too close together and you need to leave an element or two off of the secondary or the filler clusters, that's fine. Nobody's really going to notice. It's really that largest cluster that's going to draw all the attention. So here I'm picking out my medium-sized cluster, and I'm just going to repeat that one in the gaps that are left in between each of those hero clusters. And you can really start to see the pattern take shape once you get that second little grouping in. And this is so much fun to do. I make sure that I change up the orientation, turn them around. I don't want the pattern, even though it is technically a large pattern made up of multiple smaller patterns, I don't want it to look, I don't want you to be able to look at it and pick out each one. I do kind of want it to have more of an organic feel, and by rotating and flipping some of the orientation of each of the individual little groups, it keeps it from looking too much like a repeating pattern and makes it harder to find each individual group. Now, you can keep adding as much as you want, and you can stop at any point that you want. Depends on how full you want this pattern to be. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next cluster here, and I'm going to add this one. I'm not going to stay strict to it needs to be in between every single cluster. What I'm going to do here is add it where I feel like I need more of that sweet nectar color, wherever I feel like I need to break up some of that yellow. Now, I've just been eyeballing my placement, but if you're a stickler for symmetry, then you could always lightly pencil in a grid across the background and use the intersection points as placement for each of your groupings. And this would make each of them, you know, symmetrically placed and equally spaced apart. However, I just, I can't be bothered. I just like to stamp. I go for it. Sometimes they're too close, sometimes they're too far apart. But the good thing about that is that I have all of those little clusters already planned out on the side. So if one is a little too far apart, I can use one of the larger clusters to fill in that space. And if they're too close together, I can pick one of the smaller clusters and fill in that space. So it's really no big deal. So you could stop here, or you could continue to fill in like I'm about to do. Now, I normally would not use a dark color on my smallest element. However, I'm stamping these small elements multiple times. So when viewed, those clusters of little stamps, you kind of view them as one. So I can get away with using the darker color in the background. Normally, I do not use dark colors on my smallest elements because it ends up looking, your eyes just directly drawn to them, and it ends up looking almost like dots of color all over. So I usually reserve smaller elements for lighter colors, largest elements for darker colors. But in this case, I really think it works because we're stamping these little tiny images in clusters. So they kind of read as a bigger element than they are. So I'm just switching back and forth between these two small images and stamping them in clusters to fill in all the remaining gaps of the pattern. I'm being careful on this pattern not to have anything overlap because it's just not what I was going for in this pattern, but you could definitely have them overlap if that's what you're going for. And finally, as the last little detail, I'm adding these little dots into the centers of each of the sweet nectar flowers. I thought this just tied in that warm wool a little bit more. Now that that background panel is done, I'm going to set it aside and we're going to work on the sentiment. I'm going to die cut the thank you from the No One Else die, from the tag die, from our Love Shower Layers die. I'm going to use a little micropore tape to hold these together, and I'm going to run it through my Big Shot. And then I'm going to have the negative thank you die cut from my tag. And I can use the leftover letters. I can use those on another card. So here you can see now I've got that thank you die cut. And I want to add a little bit more. So I'm using the thank you kindness matters, but I'm going to mask off the thank you. I'm going to ink that up in warm wool, and I'm going to stamp another thank you above the negative thank you. And then I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to stamp it again underneath it. So it'll say thank you, thank you, thank you. I've used the transparency grid to make sure it was straight. Again, I'm going to use that Post-it tape to mask off the areas I don't want to ink up, remove it, and stamp it down. Super easy. I die cut another of the tags out of craft cardstock off camera, and I'm going to use that to place behind my thank you. This will just make it stand out a little bit more against that background. I stamped out a couple more of my clusters, and you can see here there's dies that will cut these flowers out, but I wanted them cut out as the full cluster. And I'm going to fill in the empty spaces on either side of the thank you with these clusters. So I am resorting to some good old-fashioned fussy cutting, and yeah, I'm a little rusty on my fussy cutting skills, I must say. It's kind of a lost art. However, sometimes it just fits the bill. You know what I mean? So I'm going to fussy cut out a couple of these little clusters, and then I'm going to pop these up on either side using a little foam tape. I threaded my tag with a little bit of natural jute twine, and now it's time to assemble our card. I'm going to adhere that front panel there to a standard A2 card base. That's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And again, this is our oatmeal cardstock. And then I'm just going to adhere that tag to the front of the card base using, again, a little bit of foam tape. And originally I was going to adhere it straight. However, the uneven bottom from the tags slightly offset made it look off. Like when you looked at it, one of them looked crooked. So I just decided to hang it just a little crooked, and that worked out really well. I added just a little bit of Wink of Stella to some of the little clusters there that I adhered to the tag, and that finished off the card. I absolutely love pattern stamping. It's one of my all-time favorite techniques. Now, I did want to share some other cards that I made with this stamp set. Again, this is our No One Else Stamps and Dies. Now, here on the left, you can see that it has more of a graphic feel. I used brighter colors. I just love the way this bold graphic sentiment works with these whimsical flowers. Here, I used the die cuts and popped up some of the flowers, and other parts of the flowers I stamped directly on the card base. Very simple, very easy card. Now, I also stamped out another pattern. Here you can see I used a different color palette, but a very similar pattern clustering as we did on the card that I created today. I did this one on white, and it was sitting on my desk, and I happened to get my fingerprints there on it. We'll just ignore that. But again, I wanted to show you how bright and colorful or how soft it can be. I created a similar tag to the one that we created today off camera. This one I mounted on just a piece of craft cardstock, and then I added a little banner there. Now you can go extremely graphic with this set. Here the sentiment pairs so well with the lilies from our He Is Risen stamp set. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and it gave you some ideas on how to build your own seamless patterns. This method will work great with many of the images that you might already have in your stash. But if you have any questions about any of the products featured in today's video, be sure to check the description box below. There's links to our store as well as our blog where you'll find more information on all of these products. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.